you lie down, and the shoulders stay tense anyway. An hour of stillness later, they still have not let go. Movement science reads that differently. Muscle is not only something the mind tenses, it is also an instrument the nervous system keeps listening to. Here is the quiet part. A muscle can fire for hours at a level too low to feel. You cannot sense your own resting tone. Welcome to Sleepy Science. A body scan has been running all evening. Not one you perform, but one your nervous system never stops making. Quietly, from the inside, while the room goes dark. Somewhere beneath the skin, sensors thinner than a thread are quietly measuring every muscle you are lying on. And they ask nothing from you tonight. What they have been measuring is where this begins. A muscle at rest is not a muscle switched off. Even lying down, skeletal muscle keeps a low background hum of electrical activity, called resting tone. It is not a contraction anyone would recognize. No limb moves. Nothing tightens visibly, and the person lying there feels nothing at all. Yet the wiring stays live, holding a faint readiness that never fully lapses while a person is awake. This is where tonight's question opens. If tension is not something the body holds on purpose, then releasing it cannot be something the body does on command either. What actually happens inside a muscle when it finally stops holding? And what does the nervous system do with that information? More than 600 skeletal muscles are layered across the human frame, from sheets as broad as a hand to strands finer than string. They sit in overlapping layers, wrapped and separated by thin films of connective tissue. Some are built for brief bursts of power. Others are built for endurance, holding a posture for hours with barely any change. Almost none of them work alone. A single simple movement, like turning the head toward a window, recruits a small committee of them, each contributing a fraction of the pull while others quietly let out slack. The body rarely uses one muscle at a time. It uses arrangement, and it revises those arrangements constantly, without ever mentioning it. The smallest working piece of a muscle is not a fiber. It is a motor unit, which means one nerve cell together with all the muscle fibers that nerve cell commands. When that nerve cell fires, every fiber it owns contracts at once. Nothing partial happens. Some motor units are tiny, controlling only a handful of fibers, which allows delicate work like adjusting the focus of an eye. Others are large, controlling hundreds of fibers at a time, built for lifting and pushing. Strength is not adjusted by squeezing one fiber harder. It is adjusted by how many units join in, and how quickly each one repeats. The body works in small parliaments rather than single voices. Every command that ever reaches a muscle arrives through the same narrow door. The alpha motor neuron is the nerve cell connecting the spinal cord to the muscle fibers themselves, and nothing moves without it. The English physiologist Charles Sherrington gave this arrangement its lasting name early in the 20th century, calling it the final common path. Intentions from the cortex, reflexes from the spinal cord, background drive from the brainstem, and reports from the muscle's own sensors all converge on that single cell. It adds them together and produces one answer. Whatever a shoulder is doing tonight is the sum of many arguments, settled by a cell that never explains its reasoning. Resting tone is often pictured as a muscle holding itself tight. The recordings tell a plainer story. Tone is a low, uneven trickle of firing, with small motor units switching on and off in turn, rather than one sustained clench. At any moment, only a fraction of the available units are active, and they trade places, so the same fibers are not always carrying the load. This is why a resting muscle can stay slightly firm for hours without wearing itself out. It is closer to a rotor than a grip. And because that trickle is far too faint to feel, a shoulder can be quietly working all evening while its owner is convinced it has been doing nothing. Buried inside the belly of nearly every skeletal muscle is a sensor called a muscle spindle. It is a slender capsule, thinner than a thread, lying parallel to the working fibers around it. Inside the capsule sit a few specialized fibers wrapped in nerve endings that coil around them like wire around a spool. When the muscle lengthens, the capsule lengthens with it, and those coiled endings are stretched. That stretch becomes a signal. The spindle does not register pain, temperature, or effort. It registers one thing with unusual care: how long the muscle currently is. A muscle, it turns out, comes with its own measuring instrument, installed inside the very material it measures. Length alone would be a limited report, so the spindle sends two kinds at once. Some of its nerve endings answer to how long the muscle is at this moment, a steady readout that continues for as long as the stretch is held. Others answer mainly to change, firing hard while the muscle is being lengthened and falling quiet once the movement stops. Together, they describe position and motion in the same message. It is the difference between knowing where a door is and knowing that it is swinging. The spinal cord receives both descriptions continuously, from every muscle at once, and assembles from them a picture nobody ever consciously looks at. A measuring instrument has an awkward problem. When the muscle around it shortens, the spindle would go slack and stop reporting, exactly when the report matters. The body solves this with a second, smaller set of nerve cells, the gamma motor neurons. They run to the ends of the spindle's own fibers and tighten them, keeping the sensor taut across the whole range of movement. Usually, they fire in step with the main motor command. So the sensor is retuned in the same instant the muscle is asked to move. It works something like a volume dial that adjusts itself before the room gets loud. Sensitivity here is not fixed. It is set, moment by moment, from above. Spindles are not spread evenly through the body. Muscles that need the finest control carry them in the greatest numbers, which is why the small muscles of the neck and of the hand are densely supplied, while the large muscles of the thigh carry relatively few for their size. The neck is a particular case. Holding a head steady while the eyes track something takes constant, minute correction, and correction takes measurement. So the region that aches most reliably at the end of a long day is also among the most heavily instrumented in the whole body. The place that reports the most is often the place that hurts. And the two facts are not unrelated. Much of what is known in fine detail about spindles did not come from human volunteers. The classic recordings, tracing single sensory fibers while a muscle was stretched by fractions of an inch, were made in animals, mostly cats. Through the middle of the 20th century, human work followed later, using fine electrodes placed into nerves in the arm and leg of willing volunteers. And it broadly agreed. That distinction is worth keeping in view. The architecture described here rests on animal recordings first and human confirmation second. It is unusually well settled for a piece of physiology, but none of it was learned by asking anyone how their own muscles happen to feel. Nerves running toward muscle are outnumbered by nerves running away from it. In the large nerves of a limb, a substantial share of the fibers are sensory, carrying reports inward rather than orders outward. That balance rearranges the usual picture. Muscle is not simply the place where decisions arrive and get carried out. It is also one of the body's largest sources of incoming information, filing continuously whether or not anything is happening, which quietly turns tonight's question around. The problem may not be how to send a better instruction down into a tense shoulder, but what that shoulder has been sending upward all day, and what has been done with it. At the far end of the muscle, where it narrows into tendon, sits a different sensor entirely. The Golgi tendon organ is woven among the collagen strands of the tendon itself, in line with the pull rather than beside it. Because of that position, it does not report length. It reports force, the actual tension being transmitted through the tissue at that instant. A muscle can be long and lax, or short and straining, and the spindle and the tendon organ will describe those states differently, each answering its own question. Two sensors, a few inches apart, measuring two things that are easy to confuse from the outside and never confused on the inside. The tendon organ has an unusual habit for a sensor. Its signal, arriving back at the spinal cord, tends to quiet the very muscle it came from. Through a small relay cell, rising force in a tendon feeds an inhibitory message to the motor neurons driving that muscle, easing the pull rather than encouraging it. For a long time, this was described as a simple safety catch against overload. The current picture is subtler. The pathway appears to work continuously, helping regulate how force gets shared out rather than only stepping in at extremes. Somewhere in the design there is a channel whose entire job is to say, gently and without drama, that this is enough. The fastest circuit in the body does not involve the brain. When a muscle is stretched suddenly, the spindle signal travels to the spinal cord and connects directly to the motor neurons of that same muscle, which fire back and shorten it. One sensory cell, one motor cell, one junction between them. Nothing else is consulted. The whole loop can close in a few hundredths of a second, faster than a thought can form, faster than the stretch can be noticed. This is the stretch reflex, and it runs beneath every standing posture, every stumble caught, every small sway corrected on a moving train. Most of staying upright is handled below the level where anyone is watching. There is an everyday demonstration of that circuit, familiar from any physical examination. A tap below the kneecap stretches the tendon, which briefly lengthens the muscle above it, which fires the spindles inside. The leg swings before the person has registered the tap. Clinicians look at it because a reflex that is unusually brisk, unusually sluggish, or unevenly matched between sides says something about the wiring rather than about willingness. Nobody can decide to have a livelier knee jerk, and that is precisely the useful part of it. It is one of the few places where the nervous system can be watched working without first being asked politely for permission. A pull in one direction is useless if the opposite muscle resists it. So the same sensory signal that excites one muscle also quiets its opponent through a small inhibitory cell in the spinal cord. Bend an elbow and the muscle on the underside of the arm is being encouraged while the muscle on top is being told to release. In the same instant, by the same incoming message. This arrangement is called reciprocal inhibition. It means relaxation is not merely the absence of activity. Letting go is an active instruction with its own wiring, sent as deliberately as the pull it makes room for. Release, in the body, is something built rather than something left over. Close the eyes and the body does not disappear. A person still knows where a hand is, which way a foot is turned, whether an arm is bent or straight. That sense has a name, proprioception, and it is assembled almost entirely from the spindles, the tendon organs, and sensors in the joints and skin. It works without images and without attention, which is why it is easy to forget it exists until it fails. People who lose it, through rare nerve conditions, describe having to watch their own limbs to keep track of them. The body is kept present by a sense that produces no sensation of its own, and asks for nothing. The traffic carrying all of this is heavier than it looks. Every second, the spinal cord receives an enormous stream of reports from muscle, tendon, and joint, from hundreds of places at once, at a rate no conscious mind could follow. Almost none of it is ever experienced. It is used, corrected against, and discarded, mostly at the level of the spinal cord itself. Only summaries travel upward, and only some of those summaries reach awareness at all. A person lying in the dark, convinced that nothing is happening, is in fact the destination of a vast and unbroken correspondence, of which they will read perhaps one line. Beyond position, there is a second inward sense with a broader remit. Interoception is the reading of the body's internal state, the fullness of the lungs, the beat of the heart, the temperature of the skin, the effort in a limb. It travels its own pathways and arrives in its own regions of the brain. And what it produces is often a mood rather than a fact. A body that reads as strained can generate a feeling of unease with no thought attached to it. This is the quiet doorway between muscle and mind. and traffic moves through it in both directions, though it is rarely announced as information. There is a threshold below which the body simply does not report to its owner. Low levels of muscle activity produce no sensation at all, which is why nobody notices a slightly raised shoulder at a desk, or a jaw resting a fraction too closed. Sensation tends to arrive only after tissue has been held in one arrangement long enough for its chemistry to shift, or for a joint to start complaining. By then, the state is hours old. The ache that shows up at 11 at night is not news. It is a late notification about a decision the body quietly made at 2 in the afternoon. A working muscle is squeezed from the inside. Contracting fibers press on the small vessels threaded between them, and blood moves through that tissue less freely while the pressure is on. At high effort, this is obvious. At the low, continuous effort of holding a posture, it is subtle, but it does not stop. Hours of faint activity leave a region less well flushed than the tissue around it. When the holding finally eases, flow through those vessels opens again, and warmth arrives in a place that had been quietly narrowed. Nothing has been added to the arm. Something has only stopped being pressed, and the difference is enough to feel. Set these pieces beside each other, and an unhelpful assumption starts to come apart. Tension is not a thing being clutched, because there is no clutching. There is a background drive, a set of sensors reporting into it, and a threshold of awareness sitting far above the level where all of this takes place. Nothing in that arrangement can be reached by deciding, which moves the question away from how tension might be pushed out of a muscle towards something stranger and more patient. If the holding was never chosen, what has to change before it stops? And who exactly would be the one to notice? Some muscles never really get an evening off. The anti-gravity muscles along the back of the neck, the spine, and the legs work against a constant downward pull, and their job does not pause while a person sits reading. A human head is heavy for its size, roughly the weight of a small bowling ball, and it balances on a narrow stack of bones with a modest margin for error. Holding it upright is not a single act, but a continuous, tiny negotiation, corrected again and again, far below the level of notice. By evening, those muscles have done something closer to a day of low, unbroken labor than to any recognizable exertion. Two muscles collect more of the blame than the rest. The upper trapezius, a broad sheet running from the base of the skull across to the point of the shoulder, and the levator scapulae, a narrower strap beneath it. Together, hold the shoulder girdle up and steady the neck. They are involved whenever the arms are used in front of the body, which is nearly always, and they stay involved when nothing is being lifted at all. Their activity is easy to raise and slow to release. That combination explains a good deal about where a day ends up being stored, and why it lands so consistently in the same two places. The jaw closes the picture. The masseter, the short muscle at the angle of the jaw, is among the strongest in the body for its size, and it sits in a region dense with sensation and expression. It responds to concentration and to holding something back, and it does so without any decision being made. Taken together, The first stretch of tonight has been describing an arrangement rather than a fault. A body layered with sensors it cannot feel. Driven by a background it cannot address. Holding shapes it never agreed to. All of that is what a day settles into. What has not been said yet is what happens to any of it once the lights go out. And that is where the ground begins to move. The first stretch of tonight has settled, and your shoulders have probably dropped a little without being asked. A soft subscribe helps another aching, restless body find this hour too. Let's breathe here for a moment, one sleepy soul at a time. Muscle can be listened to. Electromyography, usually shortened to EMG, picks up the small electrical signals that muscle fibers produce whenever they are active, using sensors placed on the skin or fine wires set into the tissue. The recording is not a picture of movement. It is closer to a sound level meter, showing how much electrical chatter is coming from a region at any given moment. A relaxed muscle does not fall silent on that meter. It produces a low, grainy line that rises and falls. Sleep researchers have been reading those lines for decades, and the shape the line takes as a person falls asleep is remarkably consistent from one body to the next. That line has a direction. As a person drifts from waking into light, sleep, and then deeper, the background level of muscle activity drops in stages rather than all at once. Wakeful rest already sits lower than sitting upright. Light sleep sits lower again. In the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, the line is quieter still. Nothing about this is sudden, and nothing about it is voluntary. The decline tracks the depth of sleep so closely that it can be read backwards, from the muscle upward, as a rough report on what the brain is doing. A shoulder, in its own limited way, keeps a record of the night. That line is falling somewhere on you right now. Not in one motion, but in steps. The way a room dims rather than switches off. Nobody is running it. It could not be raised or lowered by deciding to. The question left hanging a while ago, about who exactly would be the one to notice, is turning out to have a stranger answer. Nobody has to. The record keeps itself. Whatever the shoulders were holding an hour ago, the level has already moved without asking permission first. What follows goes down along that line, toward the place it is set from. Sleep is scored in laboratories using 3 kinds of signal at once, and one of them comes from muscle, alongside brain waves and eye movements. A standard sleep study records the small muscle under the chin. Because its activity tracks the transitions so reliably, the chin channel is what separates one stage from another when the brainwave pattern alone is ambiguous. A technician reading a night can often tell where sleep deepened by watching that trace settle. It is an ordinary technical detail with an odd implication. The formal definition of sleep, the one written into the scoring manuals, includes a line drawn from a muscle. Watched closely, the fall is untidy. The trace does not glide downward. It steps down, holds, sometimes lifts briefly, then steps down again, with small bursts scattered through it wherever a limb shifts or a sensor is jostled. Even in deep sleep, the line never reaches zero, partly because the equipment always picks up something, and partly because muscle never entirely stops. What changes is the floor. The quiet stretches grow longer, the bursts grow rarer, and the average settles lower hour by hour. Letting go, seen from outside, is less like a door closing than like a tide that keeps forgetting to come back in. Not every muscle steps down together. The large postural muscles along the back and legs, the ones that have been working against gravity all day, ease earliest and furthest once a body is horizontal, largely because the job they were doing has been handed over to the mattress. Muscles of the neck and jaw tend to lag behind. They quiet more slowly, and they are quicker to lift again at any disturbance. The pattern is not random. What relaxes first is what the position itself has made unnecessary, and what relaxes last is what was never really about posture in the first place. Some muscle is never allowed to rest. The diaphragm, the broad sheet beneath the lungs, contracts and releases through the entire night without a single missed round, and it does so under a control system separate from the one governing posture. During rapid eye movement sleep, tone in most skeletal muscle falls close to silence, yet the diaphragm keeps working straight through even that. It belongs to a small category of muscle that the night does not negotiate with. Nearly everything else in the body is permitted to be off-duty. Breathing is simply exempted, quietly, every night, by an arrangement nobody consciously supervises. There is a second exemption, and it is less complete. The muscles that hold the upper airway open, in the throat and around the tongue, keep a reduced but real level of activity through sleep, because a fully slack airway would narrow. Their tone falls along with everything else, only not as far, and the margin they keep is a modest one. This is part of why sleep changes the sound of breathing in most people to some degree. It is an ordinary consequence of a general decline arriving in a place where the decline has consequences. The night lowers nearly everything, and a few structures are quietly held back from following it all the way. Something in the framing has been wrong from the start. If tone falls in stages that track sleep depth, and falls furthest exactly where the mattress has taken over the work, then tone was never a thing the muscle was doing to itself. It is a readout. What it reads out is the level of a background command arriving from above, and that level is set by the state the brain is in, not by any effort a person makes. So the question quietly changes shape. It stops being how a muscle might be persuaded to let go, and becomes what that background command is actually made of. Deep in the brainstem, in a loose network of cells called the reticular formation, sits the source of that background command. It is not a control panel with a switch for each muscle. It is a general level, a broad excitability that keeps the motor neurons of the spinal cord partly primed, so that any instruction arriving finds them ready to respond. Raise that level and the whole body becomes more reactive. Lower it, and everything grows harder to rouse. The network runs continuously, adjusting through the day and through the night. And none of its adjustments are announced anywhere. Muscle tone is one of the few places where the setting becomes visible from outside. The sensors get turned down as well, alongside the main command. The gamma nerve cells that keep muscle spindles taut also reduce their output as sleep deepens. A spindle held less tightly answers less eagerly to small changes in length, which means the same faint stretch that would have produced a report an hour earlier now produces less of one. The instrument is not removed. Its gain is lowered. What a body does at night is not only stop pulling, but also stop listening quite so closely to itself. And the second half of that arrangement is easy to miss entirely. Less pull and less sensitivity add up to less traffic. The stream of reports traveling inward from muscle, tendon, and joint thins out as the night goes on, simply because there is less movement to describe and the describers have been made less responsive. That thinning matters more than it sounds, because the incoming stream is itself part of what keeps the system aroused. A body reporting heavily is a body being kept awake by its own correspondence. As the reports fall away, one of the influences holding the level up quietly withdraws, and the level drops a little further because of it. There is one more gate along that path. Nearly everything traveling from the body toward the thinking parts of the brain passes through the thalamus, a pair of structures near the center of the head that work something like a switchboard. During sleep, the switchboard becomes far less willing to pass traffic onward. Signals still arrive at it. Fewer continue. So even the reports that are still being filed have a reduced chance of reaching anywhere they could be experienced. The body goes on talking through the night. What changes is how much of it is being put through to anyone. A resting muscle at night is not an idle one. Blood continues to move through it, and with less contraction squeezing the small vessels between the fibers, it moves through more evenly than it did during the day. The tissue's demand drops, but its housekeeping does not stop. Waste products left over from the day's activity are carried away, and raw materials are delivered to where they are needed. This is unglamorous work, done in the dark, with nothing to show for it by morning, except a body that meets the next day slightly better than it otherwise would have. One of the night's larger hormone events is tied to deep sleep. The biggest daily release of growth hormone in adults tends to occur during the first stretch of slow-wave sleep, not long after falling asleep, and that association has been measured repeatedly for decades. What it means for muscle specifically is less settled. Growth hormone is involved in tissue maintenance, and overnight repair is real. But the full picture of how those two connect in ordinary adults is still being worked out. What can be said plainly is smaller and stranger. The body schedules some of its rebuilding for the hours when nobody is available to supervise it. Something in the room has slowed since this began. The sentences are longer now. The pauses are wider. And whatever the neck was doing an hour ago, it is almost certainly doing less of it. Nothing here is waiting on you. Let one breath leave without managing the end of it. We keep going, quietly, from where the night is already working. So the machinery for letting go turns out to be thorough. The command from above eases. The sensors are turned down. The traffic thins. The switchboard closes. And the mattress takes the weight. On paper, tension would simply drain out of a body the moment it lies down. Anyone who has lain awake with a rigid neck knows that it does not always work that way. Something holds on after the conditions for holding on have been removed. That gap between a system built to release and a body that does not is where the rest of tonight's questions live. Motor units are not called on at random. The smallest ones, controlling only a handful of fibers, are recruited first for any effort, and larger ones are added only as the demand grows. When the effort eases, they are released in reverse order, so the small units that started first are the last to be let go. This ordering is one of the more reliable rules in muscle physiology, and it makes good sense for smooth, graded movement. It also carries a quiet consequence. During long stretches of very light work, the load never rises enough to call in anyone else. The same small units simply stay on. Once a small unit has been switched on for a task, nothing in the design reminds it to take a turn off. A shoulder held a fraction of an inch too high at a desk asks almost nothing of the body. So almost nothing is recruited, and what little is recruited stays recruited. Hours can pass this way. The effort is far too small to register as effort, and the person feels perfectly still. Meanwhile, a narrow set of fibers has been working continuously since morning, without relief, without variation, and without ever appearing anywhere in the owner's experience of the day. One proposed explanation gives this pattern a name borrowed from a fairy tale. In the Cinderella Hypothesis, those small, first in and last out fibers are the ones left doing the drudgery, while larger units rest, and their unrelieved workload is offered as one route by which light, long-duration tasks leave tissue sore. It is worth being careful with the claim. The recruitment order itself is well established. The step from that ordering to lasting discomfort is a proposal researchers are still testing, not a settled account. What survives either way is the odd arithmetic underneath. The lightest work can be the least interrupted. Mental effort shows up in muscle, even when the body is doing nothing at all. Recordings taken while volunteers work through demanding mental tasks have repeatedly found more activity in the upper trapezius than during quiet rest, with the arms unmoved and the shoulders apparently still. The size of the effect is modest, and it varies from person to person, but its direction has turned up again and again across laboratories. Concentration, worry, and time pressure are not experienced as physical work. They are nonetheless answered physically, in a broad sheet of muscle across the top of the back, by a body nobody consulted. Long before language, the shape of alarm was already settled. Shoulders drawn up and forward, neck shortened, jaw set, chest slightly closed. It is a protective arrangement, folding the vulnerable parts inward and shielding the back of the neck. And versions of it appear across many species. Nothing about it requires a real threat to be present. A difficult conversation. A message left unanswered. A day with too much packed into it will assemble the same posture as reliably as a loud noise would. The body does not distinguish between kinds of trouble. It keeps one shape for trouble, and it holds that shape patiently. Nobody can address a single motor neuron. There is no channel running from intention to one nerve cell in the spinal cord, no dial marked with the name of a muscle, and no way to inspect the level of tone directly. What a person can do is move a joint, change position, breathe differently, or shift attention, and then wait to see what the system does in response. This is why the instruction to relax so often fails on contact. It names an outcome and supplies no route to it. The one part of the arrangement not reachable by deciding is precisely the part being addressed. Release, then, is not an action with a doer behind it. It is a condition that arrives once the things maintaining tension stop being supplied, and none of those things sit under direct control. The background level lowers when the state of the brain lowers it. The small units let go when the position stops requiring them. Attention changes what gets reported, not what gets commanded. So tonight's question loses its last piece of leverage and turns into something quieter. Not how tension is released, but what ends first, before a body is finally allowed to. Teeth grinding during sleep is common, and it is classed among the sleep-related movement phenomena rather than as anything a sleeper is doing on purpose. It tends to arrive in brief episodes, often clustered around shifts toward lighter sleep, and the person doing it is typically the last to find out. Bed partners and dentists usually notice first. Described plainly, it is a burst of activity in the jaw muscles occurring at a time when nearly every other muscle is quieting down. The jaw, slow to let go on the way down, turns out to be quick to speak again on the way back up. Held in one shape for long enough, resting muscle stiffens on its own. This is a property of the tissue rather than an act of the nervous system. The connections inside relaxed fibers settle while nothing is moving, and the whole region resists the first movement more than the second. Fascia, the thin sheeting that wraps and separates muscle, adds a reluctance of its own. The stiffness fades quickly once the part is moved, which is why a body feels different after the first shift in bed than it did before it. Stillness, held long enough, becomes something the tissue slowly gives up. Somewhere on you there is a region that has not moved in a while, and it is already stiffer than it was, with nothing having been done to it. Not from effort, from stillness. The first shift, whenever it comes, will loosen it in seconds and cost nothing at all. That is a small, ordinary demonstration of what the whole night is made of. A body that changes state without being instructed. And that goes on changing it, whether or not anyone is following along. Let the weight sit exactly where it is. What comes next goes further into that. A bed is also a learned place. When many restless nights accumulate in the same room, lying down can begin to work as a cue for alertness rather than a cue for sleep. In much the way any repeated pairing becomes an expectation, This reasoning is not a folk idea. It is the basis of one long-standing component of insomnia therapy, which works on the association rather than on the tension itself. Stated without any advice attached to it, the point is plain enough. The body keeps a record of where things tend to happen, and it consults that record before anyone has decided anything. In the 1930s, an American physician named Edmund Jacobson set out to measure something nobody had thought to measure. He wanted to know how relaxed a resting person actually was. And rather than ask them, he recorded the electrical activity of their muscles. The instruments of the period were crude by modern standards, and he spent years improving them. What came out of that work became the foundation of a method still in use nearly a century later. It began, though, as a measurement problem rather than as a therapy. Jacobson gave a name to what his recordings kept showing: residual tension. A person lying down, asked to relax completely, and entirely convinced they had done so, still produced a readable signal from the muscle. The leftover activity was small. It was also stubborn, and it did not disappear simply because the person believed it had. That gap between the reported state and the recorded one is the most durable thing to come out of his work, and it holds up in modern recordings too. The conclusion Jacobson drew has aged well. People are unreliable witnesses to their own muscle state. Asked whether an arm is relaxed, most will say yes, long before the recording agrees. And the discrepancy tends to be largest in exactly the regions carrying the most habitual load. This is not a failure of honesty or of attention. It follows from something already covered tonight. Low levels of activity sit beneath the threshold where sensation begins. The instrument sees what the owner cannot. The method Jacobson built from that observation is now known as progressive muscle relaxation. In its original form, it was slow and unhurried, working through the body region by region, using deliberate contraction as a way of making the contrast between effort and its absence obvious enough to detect. The contraction was never the point. The point was to give a person a reference mark for a state they could not otherwise locate. What has been passed down since is mostly a shortened version of something originally taught across many sessions. Methods drift as they spread. The version circulating now is often a few minutes long, delivered by recording, and detached from the measurement work that produced it. Jacobson was skeptical of abbreviated forms, and he trained people over long courses rather than single sittings. Whether the short version does what the long version did is a separate question from whether the original worked, and the two are easy to conflate. That distinction matters more than it looks, and it comes back before this stretch of the night is over. A second line of work approaches the same tissue from the other end. Instead of contracting a muscle to find it, the body scan directs sustained, unhurried attention through regions of the body in turn, noticing whatever is there without acting on it. No effort is applied. Nothing is deliberately tightened or loosened. It is an attentional practice rather than a physical one, and it entered clinical research through a different door than Jacobson's. The difference between those two doors turns out to matter later. That door opened in 1979, when John Kabat-Zinn began a program at the University of Massachusetts Medical School for patients whose conditions were not responding well to ordinary care. The 8-week course, later known as mindfulness-based stress reduction, used the body scan as one of its central practices. It was designed as a clinical program with a fixed length and a fixed structure, delivered in classes, with weekly sessions and daily practice at home. Nearly everything later tested in trials descends from that particular shape. Describing what participants did is a different act from asking anyone to do it. In the trials, people lay down and moved their attention slowly through the body across roughly half an hour, most days, for weeks at a stretch. The instruction given to them was to notice rather than to change. Some found it restful. Others found it dull, or found their attention wandering constantly, which the program treated as expected rather than as failure. This is a description of a research procedure, not a suggestion for tonight. One of the better-known trials appeared in JAMA Internal Medicine in 2015. Older adults with moderate sleep complaints were assigned either to a mindfulness program or to a course of sleep hygiene education, and the mindfulness group reported greater improvement in sleep quality by the end of it. It was a single trial, in one age group, compared against an education class rather than against nothing at all. Read at that size. It is a genuine result and a narrow one, and both halves of that sentence carry weight. Behind almost every number in this field sits a person with a pen. Nearly all of the research rests on a questionnaire. The most common one asks people to rate their own sleep over the past month, and it produces a single score that has been used in thousands of studies. It is practical, inexpensive, and reasonably consistent. It is also entirely a report of how sleep felt, which is not the same thing as a recording of how sleep went. The two can diverge. Keeping that in view changes how the numbers coming next are best read. Several teams have pooled these trials together. One systematic review gathered 14 randomized trials of progressive muscle relaxation, covering roughly 950 adults, and found a large average improvement in self-reported sleep quality. A larger analysis assembled 31 trials with around 2,300 patients and reported a similar direction and a similar size. Taken at face value, those are substantial figures, larger than what many medications manage. Almost nothing about this literature, however, can be taken at face value, and the reviewers are the first to say so. The first thing those reviews report about themselves is disagreement. The results scattered enormously from one trial to the next, with the reviewers measuring heterogeneity somewhere between 85 and 92%, which in plain terms means most of the variation came from differences between the studies rather than from chance. An average drawn across findings that disagree that sharply describes no particular trial well. No single sleeper is in that number. And so tonight's question turns once more, away from whether tension can be released, toward how much of any of this is the muscle at all. A second warning sits inside the same reviews. A statistical check for missing studies came back positive, at a level the reviewers themselves flagged. which is the usual signature of trials with disappointing results, never reaching print. When that pattern is present, pooled effects run larger than the truth by an amount nobody can calculate afterward. It does not mean the effect is absent. It means the published average is the optimistic end of a range whose other end was never published. The direction still holds. Only the size is in doubt. Study quality adds a third qualification. In the smaller review, most of the included trials carried a moderate rather than a low risk of bias, with unclear randomization procedures and, unavoidably, no way to blind participants to whether they had been relaxing their muscles or not. A person who knows they were given the promising treatment tends to rate their sleep more generously afterward. With a self-rated outcome, that expectation is not a small detail. It runs through the measurement itself. The fourth qualification is about who was studied. Most participants in these trials were patients being treated for something else. People undergoing cancer treatment, women after menopause, adults recovering from a hip fracture, adults living with cystic fibrosis, hospital staff working through a crisis. They were not, for the most part, ordinary poor sleepers with nothing else going on. Results gathered in populations under that much strain do not transfer automatically to a person lying awake in a quiet room. A tired neck in the dark is a different study. Something does survive all four qualifications. Across many trials, in many countries, with many kinds of participant, the direction of the finding stays consistent. People who practice deliberate muscle relaxation tend to report sleeping better than people who do not. The size of that benefit is uncertain and probably smaller than the pooled figures suggest. Its existence is reasonably well supported. Uncertainty about magnitude is a different thing from doubt about direction, and the two get confused constantly, in both directions. A finding can be real and still be smaller than advertised. Guideline committees weigh the same evidence and then say something practical about it. In its 2021 Clinical Practice Guideline for Chronic Insomnia in Adults, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine issued a single strong recommendation, and it went to multi-component cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. Relaxation therapy, used on its own, received a conditional recommendation instead. In that document, it sits alongside stimulus control and sleep restriction as reasonable single components rather than as the centerpiece. The wording throughout is careful, and the difference between those two words carries most of the meaning. Conditional, in that system, has a specific sense. It means the panel judged the option reasonable for many people, while acknowledging that reasonable people could choose otherwise, because the evidence was not strong enough or consistent enough to support a general rule. It is neither an endorsement nor a dismissal. Set beside the pooled figures from a moment ago, it reads as an honest summary. Something real, something uneven, something not yet settled enough to be spoken about with confidence. There is one more detail in those trials, and it is easily skipped past. The sessions were not brief. Participants typically practiced for 20 to 30 minutes at a time, repeatedly, over a course lasting weeks. What was tested in other words, was a sustained training program rather than a single short episode. Any shorter version circulating today may or may not do the same thing. It simply has not been through the same examination, and saying so is not a criticism of it. The body keeps its own clock for these things. That gap between what was studied and what gets passed along is where most of the confusion in this area is manufactured. A finding earned over 8 weeks of daily practice in a clinical population becomes 3 retellings later. A quick technique promised to work tonight. Nothing dishonest is required for that to occur. Each step shortens things slightly. Each retelling drops a qualification that felt like a technicality at the time. The result is a claim that no longer resembles the study behind it, while still carrying the study's authority. How any of it works is less settled than whether it works at all. The review authors themselves offer an explanation rather than a demonstration. That deliberate relaxation eases sympathetic arousal, the branch of the nervous system that raises readiness, and lowers stress hormone output as a result. That is a reasonable proposal, consistent with what is known. It is presented in those papers as a hypothesis, and it has not been established as the pathway. The distinction is theirs, not an outside complaint. A more colorful version of that story has spread much further. It is easy to see why. It gives a felt experience a clean cause. In it, a released muscle informs the brain that the surroundings are safe, and sleep follows from that conclusion. The framing borrows from polyvagal theory and its idea of neuroception, a proposed unconscious detection of safety or threat. The basic premises of that theory were challenged in detail in 2023, and critics note that neuroception has no agreed way of being measured in an experiment. The debate is live and unresolved. It is a story, not a finding. Something narrower can be said with more confidence. Attention directed into the body changes what the body reports, because attention alters how much of the constant incoming stream reaches awareness. The traffic runs in both directions, and it always did. That much follows from the anatomy covered earlier tonight and calls for no additional theory. Whether it is enough to explain a night of better sleep is a separate question, and nobody has answered that one cleanly yet. It may turn out that the attention mattered more than the muscle did. Whatever is arriving from your shoulders right now has been arriving all evening. Nothing was switched on for this. The only thing that has changed is how much of it is being let through. And even that is not being managed by you. Something has been gathering across these hours toward a single idea, still a little out of reach. It concerns the difference between a body that is failing and a body that is simply reporting. There is nothing here to correct. The last stretch of tonight goes toward it. So the practical picture, stated without decoration, is a modest one. Deliberate muscle relaxation appears to help some people sleep better, by an uncertain amount, through a pathway that has not been pinned down, in a form that takes longer than most versions of it admit. That is a genuinely useful thing to know, and it is far less than what is usually claimed. Knowing the smaller version has one advantage the larger version lacks. It does not set anyone up to fail. Here is what the evening has been assembling, piece by piece. A body holds tension for reasons that can be traced. A background level set from the brainstem. Small units recruited and never relieved. Sensors reporting into a system that keeps itself aroused. And a shape learned long ago for trouble. Not one of those reasons involves doing it wrong. Muscle and mind read each other continuously, and the reading runs in both directions. What remains of tonight carries that same idea. With the machinery set down, a mattress pushes back with exactly the force a body places on it. The skin holds pressure sensors, small nerve endings that fire whenever a surface presses in. They report the mattress along the shoulder blades, along the hips, along the backs of the heels. That report continues all night, whether or not anyone listens to it. The quiet truth underneath is a simple one. Lying down is not nothing happening. It is a long, steady conversation between weight and surface. Warmth often arrives in an arm a few moments after it stops bracing. A muscle that is holding tension presses on the small vessels running through it. When the holding eases, blood moves through that tissue more freely again. The warmth is not imagined, and it is not mysterious. It is circulation returning to a place that had been quietly narrowed. Something in the arm feels wider than it did a minute ago, though nothing about the arm has changed size. By evening, a shoulder can still be carrying the posture of a desk. The trapezius, the broad sheet of muscle across the upper back and neck, works against gravity all day long. It holds the head, steadies the arms, and rarely goes fully quiet. Hours of low effort leave a shape behind, and that shape does not vanish when the work ends. A shoulder in bed can look a great deal like a shoulder still at work, hours after the room went dark. The jaw closes with more force than its size would suggest. Its muscles are short, thick, and built for repetition rather than for rest. They also tighten during concentration, during waiting, during silence that is held on purpose. Many people find their teeth touching when nothing is being chewed at all. There is an old and quiet observation hidden in that. A jaw can go on holding the shape of a sentence that was never spoken out loud. Repetition teaches the body a shape, and then the body keeps it. Muscles adapt to the positions they hold most often, shortening a little on one side, lengthening on the other. Fascia, the soft webbing wrapped around every muscle, settles along those same lines. After enough years, the learned position becomes what rest itself feels like. A body lying flat is never a blank body. It is the sum of every posture it has practiced. Letting go feels heavier than holding on, which seems backward at first. A muscle under tension is carrying part of the limb's weight for itself. When that effort stops, the full weight lands on the mattress instead. Nothing has been added to the arm. Something has simply been handed over. People often describe a released arm as sinking, as though it gained mass in the dark. What they are feeling is the weight they had been carrying without ever noticing. even at complete rest. A healthy muscle is never fully switched off. Instruments that read the electrical chatter of muscle still find a low murmur inside a limb that looks perfectly still. That background level is called resting tone. It keeps the joints from going slack and keeps the body from folding in on itself. Stillness, measured closely, turns out to be a quiet kind of activity rather than the absence of any. Something settles in the body before the mind agrees that anything has changed. The breathing lengthens. The hands open a little. The face loses the small holding around the eyes. Meanwhile, the thoughts are often still going, still reviewing, still unfinished. People notice that order and find it strange. The body seems willing to soften first, without waiting for permission from the part that is still talking. Tension is usually treated as a flaw in the body's design. It behaves far more like a report that has not yet finished arriving. Muscle carries information about load, posture, effort, and all the hours behind them. That information travels inward, whether or not anyone reads it. The question this night opened has quietly turned over. Perhaps the tightness was never a fault waiting to be corrected. Perhaps it was a message that was still being delivered. Two directions of traffic run between muscle and brain at every moment. Signals climb upward, carrying news of length, of tension, of position. Signals travel downward, carrying adjustments to how much each muscle holds. Neither line waits for the other one to finish. What results is a loop rather than a chain of command. It is hard to say which end is leading, because both ends are reading and both ends are answering. Almost everything the body said tonight was never delivered. It was true anyway. A shoulder that ached at 4 o'clock sent word on time. Nobody read it. That is not a fault in the design. It is how a night gets quiet enough to sleep in. You were spared most of your own body, and you never once noticed the mercy. Some kindnesses arrive as things you are not told. You have not thought about your left foot all evening. It knew where it was the whole time. Nothing was asked of you for that to be true. Somewhere in the dark, a hand is being kept track of, patiently, by a part of you that never wanted credit. The body holds its own shape without your attention. It has been doing this since long before you could describe it. Some nights the body turns loud, a pulse in the ear, a jaw that will not sit still. Nothing new arrived on those nights. The same traffic was always there. Only the door opened wider. Loudness is not damage. It is nearness. On the quiet nights, the body is saying just as much, and you are simply further away from it. Tonight, it has been speaking softly. Every night, the body has let go without being asked. That includes the nights you were sure you had failed. On the evening, you lay awake until 3. It was still happening, underneath the worry about whether it was happening at all. Failing at sleep is mostly a story told about a body that was already doing the work. Nothing was ever waiting on your verdict. Every night, for a whole lifetime, the body releases itself without instruction. Nobody has to remember how. It happened in childhood, through illness, on difficult nights and easy ones alike. Thousands of times, the same quiet competence, repeated without applause. It is one of the least noticed skills a person owns. Nothing about it depends on being understood, and nothing about it waits for the day to have gone well. Inside every muscle sit sensors thinner than sewing thread, keeping watch on length. Lying down does not switch them off. Through the night, they go on measuring, go on reporting, go on noting what the limb is doing. Their news travels inward, with no need for attention anywhere along the way. A sleeping body is still being read from the inside, carefully and continuously, by instruments it never has to think about at all. A position held long enough stops being felt. Sensory endings that fire briskly at first begin to fire less as nothing changes. That fading is called adaptation, and it happens all over the body. The collar on the neck disappears. The ring on the finger disappears. Tension that has stayed steady for hours can disappear in exactly the same way. Some of what a body carries goes unnoticed simply because it never moved. Worry arrives in the muscles without ever being invited there. Thinking about a difficult conversation can lift the low-level activity in the jaw and the shoulders. No decision is made to tighten anything. The change simply appears alongside the thought, and it can be measured in the tissue itself. What happens in the mind rarely stays in the mind alone. It has an address in the body, and the body keeps the mail. Only the loudest signals from the body tend to break into awareness. An ache reaches it. A cramp reaches it. The steady, ordinary hum of 100 muscles holding position does not. That filtering is useful, since a mind flooded with body news could not think about anything else. Still, it means a person lives one floor above a building that is always busy, hearing only the occasional footstep. Nothing in this process is waiting for supervision. Breathing continues without a decision behind it. Tissue is repaired. Position is adjusted. And the heart keeps its own count. The person who most wants the rest is also the one least involved in making it. That arrangement is quietly generous. The night's work goes on whether the day was finished, forgiven, or simply survived. Restlessness in bed is often read as failure at something simple. Bodies that have been braced all day do not always unbrace on schedule. The tissue holds its habit for a while, the way a hand holds a shape after gripping something for hours. A body that takes its time is not doing anything wrong. It is finishing something it began long before the lights went out, at its own unhurried pace. An aching shoulder is carrying a record, not a defect. Every hour of lifting, leaning, reaching, and waiting left a small deposit in that tissue. The soreness is what working muscle feels like after it has worked. It asks for nothing except time. There is an odd tenderness in that arrangement. The part of the body that hurts most tonight is usually the part that carried the most. Muscle is patient in a way that is easy to overlook. It holds whatever it is given to hold, for as long as it is given. It does not argue about whether the load was fair or whether the day was reasonable. When the load finally lifts, it lets go without keeping score. There is no resentment stored anywhere in tissue. There is only fiber and time and the long habit of carrying. The last thing a body does each night is stop bracing. The weight settles. The jaw drifts slightly open. The hands unclose without ever being asked. Nothing announces the moment, and nobody is awake to witness it happening. That is the strange grace of the whole arrangement. The kindest thing the body does for a person happens only after that person has stopped watching. The body was never waiting to be fixed. All night it has been reading you. The weight you set down, the breath you let go, the hours you finally stopped holding. It has been answering you the whole time, gently, in a language older than words. And now it is allowed to put the day down. So are you. There is nothing left tonight to carry. We began tonight asking why a body still holds on long after it has lain down. We end somewhere else entirely, with that holding turned into information, and with a night that reads it without any help from us. Along the way, we met the muscle spindle, a sensor thinner than a thread, keeping watch inside the muscle itself. We sat with Jacobson, measuring the tension left in a muscle a person believed was already resting. The question of why the tension stays became the quieter fact that it was never a mistake in the first place. Nothing in you was ever working against the night. Body and mind have been reading each other the whole time, and neither one of them was in charge. What felt like resistance was only the reading, out loud. For anyone lying down tonight with a tense, aching body that will not settle, this hour was made for you. A gentle like, subscribe, or share helps it find the next restless person searching in the dark for something quiet to lie down with. One quiet tap, one peaceful night at a time. Somewhere in the shoulder, a muscle that has been holding since morning is letting the mattress take its weight instead. Fibers that were bearing a small load are handing it over, one quiet letting go at a time. Nothing is being done to make that happen. It is already underway, the way it has been on every other night of your life, without a single word from you. Let the difference between what you are carrying and what the bed is carrying go soft. Nothing tonight is waiting to be held by you. You can allow these thoughts to settle now, like a limb sinking into a bed already holding it. Let your body grow heavier than a moment ago. Sleep is not something to arrange. It arrives the way the letting go does. More hours wait in relaxing body science facts to fall asleep, spent in this same territory. One question tonight never reached. What does the body go on doing while you forget it? That hour is waiting whenever you are ready. But if your eyes are closed, stay there. Rest well, weary one. Your body has been reading you all night. It never asked you to be finished. Where science becomes the softest place to rest. Good night.